The sound of palm against cheek echoed through the kitchen like a thunderclap. Margaret Wilson stumbled backward, her glasses flying from her face and clattering across the granite countertop. For a moment, the world blurred not just from missing lenses, but from the shock that froze her lungs mid-breath. "Who do you think you are?" Vanessa's voice cut through the silence sharp as the knife that lay between them on the cutting board. "Tomorrow you will be out of this house, and don't expect a single penny." Margaret's hand trembled as it rose to her cheek, feeling the heat blooming beneath her fingertips. Across the kitchen, the woman who had been her daughter-in-law for 15 years stood with her chest heaving, blonde hair perfect, despite the day's events, makeup still flawless, though her husband, Margaret's only son, had been lowered into the ground just hours ago. Behind Vanessa, the refrigerator remained covered in James's photographs, smiling moments captured in time. His eyes, so like Margaret's own, seemed to witness this betrayal with the same shock she felt coursing through her veins. "The funeral reception is still happening in our living room," Margaret whispered, tasting the salt of tears that had begun streaming silently down her face. "Your guests, they'll be gone soon," Vanessa interrupted, adjusting her black dress with manicured fingers. "And so will you. This isn't a discussion." Margaret retrieved her glasses, hands shaking so badly she nearly dropped them again. A thin crack had formed across one lens, a jagged line that seemed to perfectly mirror the fissure now splitting her life in two. "You won't turn my son's farewell into a scene," she finally said, straightening her shoulders despite the weight bearing down upon them. "Not today." Vanessa's response was a cold, dismissive smile, the kind reserved for opponents already defeated. Later, as the clock on her nightstand glowed 300 a.m. in harsh red numerals, Margaret sat on the edge of her bed, silent tears tracing familiar paths down her cheeks. The small bedroom, the one James had insisted she make her own when she'd moved in 2 years ago, now felt like borrowed space, a temporary shelter about to be revoked. The funeral clothes she'd worn lay discarded on a chair, and 4 suitcases stood packed by the door. Each item folded represented memories, sweaters worn while reading to her granddaughter Lily, blouses from holiday dinners, the scarf James had given her last Christmas, each crease a reminder of all she would leave behind. "I've lived 68 years, she whispered to the darkness, her voice a thread of sound in the silent house. "I've buried a husband and now my only son, but nothing cuts deeper than becoming a stranger in the home I helped build." Her fingers found the silver frame on her nightstand, James at his college graduation arm, slung around her shoulders, both beaming with pride. 24 years old then, with his whole life ahead of him. Not 46 and cold in the ground, taken by a heart that had simply stopped without warning one Tuesday afternoon at his desk. Margaret traced his face through the glass. "What am I supposed to do now?" she asked the smiling image. No answer came. Only the distant sound of the heating system cycling on breathing warmth into a house that now felt colder than any winter she'd known. On her dresser sat the remnants of her former life, a modest jewelry box containing her wedding ring and Robert's watch, photographs spanning decades, a small ceramic bird James had made in elementary school, her teacher's credentials framed alongside awards from 35 years teaching English at Milwaukee West High School. In one faded photo, her warm brown skin contrasted with the brilliant white of her graduation gown, a reminder of her own journey through education before dedicating her life to teaching others. It seemed impossible that just 10 years ago she'd been Margaret Wilson, wife of Robert, mother of James, respected educator with a home of her own. Then Robert's lungs had filled with cancer, stealing first his breath, then his life. That loss had been devastating, but she'd had James to lean on to help her navigate grief's treacherous waters. Now she was just Margaret. Widow, bereaved mother, unwanted guest. As she packed the final items into her carry bag, her fingers brushed against something cold and metallic in the pocket of her cardigan. The silver key. She'd almost forgotten. 3 weeks before his death, James had pressed it into her palm after dinner when Vanessa was upstairs helping Lily with homework. "Keep this," he'd said, voice low and urgent. "Don't tell anyone. You'll understand later." She'd wanted to question him, but something in his eyes, a shadow, a warning, had stopped her. She'd simply nodded and slipped the key into her pocket. Now examining it under the dim bedside lamp, she noticed its distinctive cut and the small numbers etched into its base, A517. Within the same pocket, her fingers found something else, an envelope she hadn't noticed before. Inside was a business card for Samuel Bennett, attorney at law, and a note in James's familiar handwriting, "Mom, if I'm gone someday, see Mr. Bennett. I've arranged everything." Margaret stared at these items, her mind racing to connect dots she couldn't yet see. A chill ran through her that had nothing to do with the pre-dawn air. Had James known? Had he sensed something coming? Or had he simply been cautious, preparing for contingencies the way he'd always done in his architectural work? She tucked both items back into her pocket, feeling for the first time since the funeral a tiny spark ignite within her chest. Not hope exactly, it was too soon for that, but something adjacent to it. Purpose, perhaps, a direction when all paths seemed to have disappeared beneath her feet. Outside her window, headlights swept across the lawn as an early morning commuter drove past. The world was continuing its rotation, indifferent to her suffering. In just a few hours, she would be expected to vacate this house, the house she'd helped James and Vanessa buy when they'd moved to this upscale Milwaukee suburb. After Robert died, she'd sold their modest home in the Chicago suburbs for $180,000. Without hesitation, she'd given James and Vanessa $40,000 toward their down payment. It had seemed the right choice at the time, investing in family and being close to her son and granddaughter as she aged. "Think of it as a boost," James had said. "When you want a smaller place later, I'll help you." She'd trusted him completely, hadn't worried about paperwork or formal agreements. James would take care of her. He always had. But James was gone now, and the safety net he'd provided had vanished with him. Margaret moved to her window, drawing back the curtain to look at the pristine suburban landscape. The Wilson home sat on a tree-lined street of similar upper-middle-class houses, 2 stories, attached garages, manicured lawns. From the outside, they projected stability and success. Inside, they held stories far more complicated. In the 2 years she'd lived here, Margaret had tried her best not to be a burden. She cooked dinner most nights, tended the garden that Vanessa had no interest in, picked up Lily from school, and kept the house clean. She'd covered small household expenses and considered it her contribution to the family that had taken her in. Only they hadn't really taken her in had Vanessa had tolerated her using Margaret's presence as free childcare and housekeeping while subtly undermining her at every turn, criticizing her cooking as too heavy or too old-fashioned, suggesting that Margaret's way of doing laundry would ruin the fabrics, questioning her advice to Lily, dismissing her experiences as outdated. James had tried to mediate, to smooth things over, to keep peace in a house increasingly divided by silent battles. Now Margaret understood why. He'd known Vanessa better than Margaret ever had. He'd anticipated this moment and tried to prepare for it. As dawn broke over the neighborhood, Margaret finished her packing and sat in the kitchen with a cup of tea. The house remained silent, Vanessa and Lily still asleep upstairs. On the refrigerator, held by magnets shaped like tiny houses, were Lily's science fair certificate, a family photo from their trip to Yellowstone 2 summers ago, and the schedule for Lily's 7th grade activities. Margaret memorized her granddaughter's upcoming events, knowing she might not be welcome at them anymore. Chorus concert next Thursday, science competition the following Tuesday, soccer game Saturday morning. 12 years old, and already so much like James, thoughtful, observant, with a quiet intelligence that revealed itself in unexpected moments. Would Lily understand why her grandmother had suddenly disappeared? Would Vanessa poison the relationship, turning Margaret into the villain of some fabricated story? The thought sent a fresh wave of pain through her chest. Losing James was unbearable. Losing Lily, too, might destroy her completely. Margaret washed her teacup, dried it, and returned it to its proper cabinet. She wiped down the countertops, leaving the kitchen spotless as always. Then she began carrying her luggage to her 10-year-old Honda parked in the driveway. The neighborhood slept on as she loaded 4 suitcases into the trunk, placed a box of fragile items on the back seat, and took one final look at the house. From the outside, it appeared peaceful, a lovely home where a family lived and loved. How deceiving appearances could be. She drove away as the first hints of sunlight touched the eastern sky, no one witnessing her departure. No one knowing that the woman who had cared for their children, brought casseroles during illnesses, and tended the community garden, was slipping away like a ghost at dawn. 30 miles later, Margaret pulled into the parking lot of the Lakeside Motel, a roadside establishment with a flickering vacancy sign, throwing cold blue light across the asphalt. The lobby smelled of cigarettes despite the no smoking signs, and the clerk barely looked up from his phone as he processed her credit card and handed over a key attached to a plastic fob. Room 114 offered little comfort, a sagging double bed with thin floral bedspread carpet worn to threads near the bathroom door walls, a dingy shade once intended to be beige. The air smelled of industrial cleaner and mildew, a far cry from the lavender-scented sheets she'd maintained at home. Home. She no longer had one. Margaret sat on the edge of the bed, removed her shoes, and finally allowed herself to fully feel the devastation that had been building since that slap in the kitchen. Her sobs came from deep within the primal wail of a mother who had lost her child and her place in the world in one cruel sweep. Time lost meaning as grief overwhelmed her. When she finally lifted her head, the bedside clock showed nearly noon. She'd been crying for hours, her body now empty of tears, but still heavy with sorrow. With trembling hands, she once again retrieved the silver key and the note from James. She studied the attorney's business card, Samuel Bennett and Associates, with an office address in downtown Milwaukee. The card was slightly worn at the edges, as if James had carried it for some time before passing it to her. I've arranged everything he'd written. What did that mean? What had James known or suspected that drove him to make arrangements with an attorney? And what was this key for? Margaret reached for the motel phone and dialed the number on the card. A receptionist answered promptly, her voice professionally pleasant. Bennett and Associates, how may I direct your call? My name is Margaret Wilson. I need to speak with Samuel Bennett. My son James Wilson was his client. James recently passed away. A pause. One moment, please, Mrs. Wilson. The line clicked to hold music, a generic classical piece that failed to soothe Margaret's frayed nerves. Then another click. Mrs. Wilson. A deep male voice, steady and measured. This is Sam Bennett. First, please accept my condolences for your loss. Margaret gripped the receiver tighter. Thank you, Mr. Bennett. My son mentioned you. He trusted you. James worked with me for some time. Bennett confirmed, his tone softening slightly. Before he passed, he left certain documents and instructions. We should meet in person to discuss them. Could you come to my office tomorrow at 2:00? Yes. Margaret agreed, relief flooding through her at having a purpose, a direction. Tomorrow at 2. I'll be there. Excellent. And Mrs. Wilson, James spoke very highly of you. He wanted to make sure you would be taken care of no matter what happened. After ending the call, Margaret sat in the faded armchair by the window, watching cars streak past on the highway. James had prepared something. Her son had anticipated. What, his own death, or the aftermath? Had he known how Vanessa would react? Had he seen the true nature of the woman he'd married? For the first time since the funeral, Margaret felt something beyond grief stir within her, the faint embers of resolve. James had left her a path forward. She would follow it not just for herself, but to honor the son who had thought of her welfare, even when facing his own mortality. The next day arrived with gray skies and intermittent drizzle perfectly matching Margaret's mood as she navigated downtown Milwaukee traffic. She dressed carefully in a navy blue dress and gray cardigan, modest professional attire that felt like armor for the unknown confrontation ahead. Bennett and Associates occupied the 3rd floor of a brick office building. The reception area featured dark wood paneling, leather chairs, and discreet lighting, the kind of understated elegance that spoke of established success and discretion. Margaret gave her name to the receptionist, then took a seat, hands clasped tightly in her lap. Before long, a silver-haired man in his 60s emerged from an inner office, extending his hand in greeting. "Mrs. Wilson, I'm Samuel Bennett. Please come in." His office continued the theme of tasteful professionalism, bookshelves lined with legal volumes, a substantial desk, and large windows overlooking the city. He gestured for her to take one of the chairs facing his desk, his eyes betraying momentary surprise at her elegant appearance, Margaret's deep mahogany complexion and silver-streaked hair giving her a distinguished presence that matched his own polished demeanor. "Again, my sincere condolences on your loss," he said, settling into his own chair. "James was not just a client, but someone I came to respect greatly." "Thank you," Margaret replied, her voice steady despite the emotions churning beneath her composed exterior. "My son gave me your card and a key before he passed. He said you would explain." Bennett nodded, opening a folder on his desk. "James came to me approximately 4 months ago with concerns about his financial situation and family dynamics. He wanted to ensure certain protections were in place, particularly for you." The attorney paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "Mrs. Wilson, are you aware that the reading of your son's will is scheduled for tomorrow afternoon?" Margaret blinked in surprise. "No, I haven't been informed of anything. After the funeral yesterday, Vanessa told me to leave the house. I'm staying at a motel." Bennett's expression darkened slightly. "I see. That's unfortunate, but perhaps not unexpected given the circumstances." He made a note on a legal pad. "The reading is set for 3 o'clock tomorrow at my office. As James's mother and a named beneficiary, you absolutely should attend." "Beneficiary?" Margaret echoed, confusion evident in her voice. "I wasn't expecting anything. The house is in James and Vanessa's names. I assumed everything would go to her and Lily." "The primary estate distribution does flow that way," Bennett confirmed. However, James made certain specific provisions that he wanted to ensure were properly executed. He slid a sealed envelope across the desk. "This contains information regarding those provisions, including documentation for the safe deposit box that key opens." Margaret stared at the envelope, her fingers trembling slightly as she reached for it. "Safe deposit box. Yes. Box A5117 at First Midwest Bank Downtown Branch. James established it earlier this year and was quite specific about its contents being reserved for you alone." Bennett's gaze was steady. "I suggest you visit the bank after our meeting today. The necessary authorization is in that envelope." Margaret tucked the envelope into her purse, mind racing with questions. "Mr. Bennett, did James say why he felt these measures were necessary? Did he suspect something might happen to him?" The attorney hesitated, professional discretion visibly at war with compassion. James was concerned about certain financial decisions being made without his full knowledge. He wanted to ensure you had resources independent of the main estate. Another pause. "He mentioned tensions regarding your position in the household." Margaret felt heat rise to her cheeks. The private struggles she'd endured apparently hadn't been as hidden as she'd thought. "Vanessa and I have had disagreements about my role. I tried to contribute to help with Lily in the house. I thought things were manageable." "James worried they might not remain so if anything happened to him," Bennett said gently. "Hence these precautions." Their meeting concluded with arrangements for Margaret to attend the will reading the following day. As she drove to First Midwest Bank, the rain intensified, sheets of water cascading down her windshield in rhythm with the questions flooding her mind. The bank's downtown branch exuded institutional permanence, marble floors, high ceilings, the hushed atmosphere of serious financial matters. Margaret approached the customer service desk envelope clutched tightly. "I need to access a safe deposit box," she explained to the woman behind the counter. "Box A517. I have the key and authorization." The bank officer, a middle-aged woman with a nameplate reading Peterson, examined the documents from the envelope. "Of course, Mrs. Wilson. We were expecting you. Please follow me." They passed through several secured doors, each requiring Ms. Peterson's access card, before reaching the vault area. The final door was thick and gray with an electronic keypad and 2 keyholes. "I'll use the master key, and you'll use your customer key," Ms. Peterson explained. Margaret inserted her silver key with fingers that trembled so badly she nearly dropped it. A click, and the door swung open to reveal a room lined with metal drawers of various sizes. Box A517 sat on the third shelf, longer and deeper than Margaret had expected. It required both hands to pull it from its slot and carry it to the private viewing room Ms. Peterson indicated. "Take as much time as you need," the bank officer said kindly. "I'll be just outside when you're finished." Alone with the mysterious box, Margaret took a deep breath and turned her key in the lock. The lid lifted smoothly, revealing contents that made her gasp. On top lay a brown envelope labeled simply, "For Mom." With shaking hands, she opened it and began to read. "Mom, if you're holding this, what I feared has happened. I'm sorry I can't protect you by being there, but I've prepared so you'll never be abandoned. You deserve peace in your life. No one has the right to throw you out on the street." Tears fell onto the letter, blurring the ink. Margaret quickly wiped them away, unwilling to lose a single word of her son's final message. Beneath the letter lay a thick stack of financial documents neatly organized with tabs: bank statements, investment agreements, stock certificates. Margaret leafed through them, eyes widening as she grasped the total amount, nearly $200,000, all in her name. James had taken her original $40,000 contribution to the house, invested it over time, and built this nest egg specifically for her. He'd created a financial safety net, completely independent of his main estate money Vanessa couldn't touch. But there was more. In a separate red folder marked Documentation, Margaret found printed emails, text message screenshots, and financial records. The first line of a text message from Vanessa to someone named Victor hit her like another slap. "She just needs to hurry up and die and leave her pension. I'll find a legal way to get it." That text had been sent over a year ago. Margaret's hands trembled as she read more exchanges between Vanessa and Victor, who appeared to be her brother. Messages discussing Margaret as a burden, planning ways to limit her access to family decisions, complaints about her presence in their home. Financial records showed luxury purchases made on days when Vanessa had claimed they couldn't afford groceries. Evidence of attempts to access Margaret's teacher's pension information. Notes about consulting with a lawyer regarding elder care options and competency evaluations. At the bottom of the stack was an old family photo, Margaret and James on his college graduation day. On the back, in James's handwriting, "Mom, you're the reason I got here. Never forget that." Margaret pressed the photo to her chest, overwhelmed by contradictory emotions, devastating grief at losing her son, profound gratitude for his foresight, and a burning anger at the betrayal he had documented so carefully. James had seen everything. He'd recognized Vanessa's true nature and quietly gathered evidence to protect his mother when he no longer could. The realization brought fresh tears, not just of sorrow, but of a strange, bittersweet comfort. Her son had loved her enough to create this safety net, this path to survival. Ms. Peterson knocked gently before entering. "Is everything all right, Mrs. Wilson?" Margaret looked up, aware of how she must appear tear-streaked and clutching papers. "Yes, my son. He was very thorough." "I met Mr. Wilson several times when he came in," Ms. Peterson offered quietly. "He mentioned you often. I believe he loved you very much." Margaret nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. She carefully repacked the box's contents into her large purse, securing the financial documents and evidence for whatever came next. Outside, the rain had stopped, leaving the city streets glistening in afternoon sunlight. Margaret sat in her car, thoughts racing. She now had resources evidence, a measure of security. But tomorrow would bring the official will reading and a confrontation with Vanessa. Her phone rang, the screen lighting up with Vanessa's name. Margaret's stomach clenched, but she answered. "Hello, Vanessa." "Margaret." Her daughter-in-law's voice dripped false sweetness. "Are you free this afternoon? I think we should sit down and talk about everything. I don't want the family to fall apart. I made roast chicken your favorite." Margaret tightened her grip on the steering wheel, a thin smile forming on her lips. Vanessa had clearly heard about the will reading and was attempting damage control. "Sure," Margaret replied evenly. I'll come over. She knew Vanessa wasn't extending this invitation out of kindness. Now that she'd learned about the safe deposit box, she wanted to discover what James had left. But this time Margaret wouldn't arrive empty-handed. She had truth evidence money. She had her son's quiet protection. This meeting would be the first confrontation since the will reading, and Margaret would no longer play the role of the compliant mother-in-law. The game had changed. "See you at 4, Margaret said, ending the call. She started the car, a new resolve, steadying her hands on the wheel. James had given her weapons not for revenge but for justice and survival. She would use them wisely. "Thank you, son," she whispered as she pulled into traffic. "I won't let them trample me anymore." The stage was set. The next act would begin. The reading of James Wilson's will took place the following day in Samuel Bennett's office, the same wood-paneled space where Margaret had learned of her son's precautions. The atmosphere crackled with tension as Vanessa entered dressed impeccably in a fitted black dress, her brother Victor at her side in a crisp charcoal suit. Margaret sat quietly across from them, hands folded in her lap, watching Vanessa's confident smile, the smile of someone who believed victory was assured. "Thank you all for coming." Bennett began, his voice professionally neutral. "I know this is a difficult time, but James left very specific instructions. I'll read the will exactly as written." The first portions were as expected. The house cars, retirement accounts, and life insurance policy all left to Vanessa. With each asset named, Vanessa's smile grew, her eyes occasionally flicking to Margaret with barely concealed triumph. Margaret remained still, her expression giving nothing away. She was waiting. Bennett paused, adjusting his glasses. His tone shifted subtly. However, 3 months before his passing, James added an addendum to his will. I'll read it verbatim. The air in the room changed. Vanessa leaned forward, eyes narrowing. "I, James Wilson, leave the entire contents of safe deposit box A517 at First Midwest Bank, along with all related documents and accounts therein, to my mother, Margaret Wilson, with full and exclusive ownership." Silence fell heavy as a stone. Margaret could hear her own heartbeat in her ears. Vanessa slammed her hand on the table. "What? That's impossible. James never mentioned any safe deposit box." Bennett looked up calmly. "Ma'am, I personally witnessed him sign this addendum. He was fully competent. I have medical verification attached. There's nothing improper here." Victor cut in, voice tight. "We demand verification. This could be forged." "You're entitled to request verification," Bennett replied evenly. "But be aware this document is lawful and already filed with the county court. If you wish to contest it, the process will be lengthy and the outcome uncertain. I advise respecting the deceased's wishes." Vanessa's face flushed with anger. Her hand trembled as she gripped her purse. She turned to Margaret, eyes blazing. "You knew about this, didn't you? You put James up to it." Margaret shook her head slowly. "No, I'm as surprised as you are. James never told me about a safe deposit box." She paused, meeting Vanessa's gaze directly. "But perhaps my son knew better than anyone that his mother needed protection." Vanessa let out a short, brittle laugh. Victor placed a restraining hand on her shoulder, whispering something that made her fall silent. Bennett handed Margaret a sealed envelope. "These are the authorization documents confirming your rights to the box contents. The bank will proceed with full access once they have the death certificate. Everything inside is yours exclusively." Margaret accepted the envelope, feeling its weight not just of paper, but of her son's final gift, security, independence, truth. Vanessa's eyes fixed on the envelope with naked hunger, as if she might snatch it away. Perhaps instinct warned her the box contained more than money. Perhaps she sensed James had seen through her facade and preserved evidence of her true nature. The meeting ended with tension thick in the air. Vanessa shot to her feet, chair scraping loudly against the floor. She yanked Victor's arm and stormed toward the exit. At the door, she turned back, staring Margaret down with cold fury. "Don't think you've won. This isn't over." The door slammed behind them, leaving Margaret and Bennett in momentary silence. "Your son was very thorough, Mrs. Wilson," the attorney said quietly. "He planned for every contingency. Trust that he wanted you protected." Margaret nodded, throat tight with emotion. Tears welled in her eyes, but these weren't tears of despair. They came from a wellspring of renewed strength, the knowledge that even in death, her son stood beside her. As she left the office and stepped onto the bustling downtown sidewalk, Margaret felt the afternoon sun warm against her face. The world continued its normal rhythms, traffic-flowing pedestrians hurrying past clouds drifting overhead. But inside her, something fundamental had shifted. James had given her not just financial security, but ammunition for the battle ahead. Vanessa wouldn't surrender easily. The confrontation at the chicken dinner loomed, and beyond that, an uncertain future. Yet for the first time since James's death, Margaret felt the heavy fog of helplessness beginning to lift. In her purse lay evidence resources and her son's unwavering belief in her resilience. Whatever came next, she would face it standing tall. James had made sure of that. The Wilson home looked exactly as Margaret remembered its colonial facade gleaming in the afternoon sun. For 2 years she had tended the hydrangeas flanking the walkway, pruned the roses along the fence, swept these very steps. Now she approached as a visitor, her heart drumming against her ribs. She had driven here directly from the will reading, still processing the shock on Vanessa's face, when Samuel Bennett had read the addendum about the safe deposit box. That moment of victory had been fleeting but sweet, a small vindication after days of humiliation. Margaret adjusted her simple gray dress, a far cry from the designer outfit Vanessa had worn to the lawyer's office. She carried a small gift bag containing a framed photo of James at his college graduation, one Vanessa had never seen. It was both peace offering and strategic move. Margaret understood the chess game that had begun, and this was merely the opening gambit. The door swung open before she could ring the bell. Vanessa stood framed in the entrance, blonde hair now pulled into a perfect chignon, wearing a pristine white dress that seemed calculated to project innocence. The smile stretching her lips never reached her eyes. "Margaret, you're here. I'm really glad," she chirped, voice dripping with artificial warmth. "Come in, please." The house smelled of roast chicken and lemon polish, immaculately clean, as if preparing for a magazine photo shoot rather than a family meal. Margaret's gaze swept across the living room, noting how photos had been rearranged since her departure. Several featuring her were now conspicuously absent. "I brought you something," Margaret said, extending the gift bag. "I thought you might like to have it." Vanessa accepted it with feigned enthusiasm, manicured nails tearing through tissue paper. Upon seeing the photographed James in his cap and gown, arm around his mother, years before he'd met Vanessa, something flickered across her face. For a heartbeat, the mask slipped, revealing a flash of jealousy before the practiced smile snapped back into place. "Beautiful picture." "Thank you, Margaret," she said, setting the frame aside with minimal care, as if it were a casual trinket rather than a precious memory. "The dining room is ready," Vanessa continued, ushering Margaret through the familiar hallway. "I've made all your favorites." The table gleamed with polished silver and fine china, the wedding set Margaret had rarely seen used during her time in the house. A vase of fresh roses centered the tableau, flanked by tall taper candles. It was a performance staged for an audience of one. "It looks lovely," Margaret said, taking the offered seat. Under her cardigan, nestled in her bra, was the tiny voice recorder she had retrieved from her old teaching supplies at the motel. She felt its weight against her skin, a small comfort. Vanessa served roast chicken with precision arranging vegetables in an artful display before pouring white wine into crystal glasses. "To James," she said, raising her glass, a practiced catch in her voice. Margaret touched her glass to Vanessa's, watching her daughter-in-law over the rim as she sipped. In the soft dining room light, she looked younger than her 42 years, beautiful in the conventional way that had always made Margaret feel slightly dowdy by comparison. But now, knowing what lay beneath that polished exterior, Margaret saw only the calculation in those blue eyes. The meal progressed through small talk, Vanessa mentioning repairs the house needed, rising property taxes, how difficult managing finances alone would be. Each comment layered with subtle implications about money concerns, carefully planting seeds. Margaret played along, responding with appropriate sympathy while mentally noting each manipulative turn. This was the groundwork, she realized. The setup for whatever Vanessa truly wanted. Halfway through dessert, it came. "Margaret," Vanessa said, setting down her fork and propping her chin on one hand, a practiced gesture of intimacy. "I know you went to the bank. I'm not stupid." Her smile remained, but her voice hardened slightly. "So what did you find in the box?" Playing innocent. Margaret looked up with widened eyes. "Oh, nothing much. Just a few old photos, some keepsakes. James was sentimental that way." Vanessa narrowed her eyes, suspicion flickering across her features. "Really, I think there must be something more valuable. James wouldn't keep a whole safe deposit box for a few pictures." Margaret shrugged, affecting indifference. Meanwhile, her hand quietly placed a black pen on the table beside her water glass. Not a normal pen, but the mini recorder she'd activated with a subtle press as she set it down. "I suppose he wanted to make sure I had something of him," she offered vaguely. Vanessa poured herself more wine, took a long sip, then lowered her voice conspiratorially. "Margaret, we're both adults here. I'll be blunt. If you cooperate, I'll give you a cut. We both know James left something substantial, and it's better for everyone if we make a private arrangement. You'll have money to rent a place, and I won't have to drag this into court. Win-win." Margaret sat perfectly still, looking directly into those cold eyes. For a moment, she saw past the makeup to the predator beneath. This wasn't just greed, but open contempt masquerading as pragmatism. She nodded slightly, her voice deliberately unsteady. "You really believe James would want me to hide what he left?" Vanessa jumped in immediately, impatience breaking through her facade. "Don't bring up James. He's gone. We have to be practical now. If you're smart, you'll work with me. If not, you'll get nothing but a few meaningless photos." Margaret bit her lip, pretending to consider the offer while her recorder captured every damning word. "Let me think about it. This is all so overwhelming." "Don't take too long," Vanessa warned, her tone hardening further. "My offer won't stay open indefinitely." When lunch finally ended, Vanessa walked Margaret to the door, still maintaining the pretense of family harmony. "I hope you'll consider my proposal seriously. I don't want tension between us. Family should stick together." Margaret clasped Vanessa's hand and looked her in the eye, allowing genuine emotion to surface for the first time. "Yes, family should stick together. And don't worry, I won't forget what you said today." She turned and left the pen recorder secure in her pocket, heavy with incriminating evidence. In her mind, Vanessa's calculating voice echoed, "If you cooperate, I'll give you a cut." Another piece in the growing collection of proof that would eventually become Vanessa's undoing. The following morning, Margaret sat in the faded armchair by the motel window, watching raindrops race down the glass. Her night had been restless, punctuated by dreams of James calling out warnings she couldn't quite hear. She felt drained yet oddly focused, like a general plotting strategy before a crucial battle. A gentle knock at her door startled her from her thoughts. Who could possibly know she was staying here? Cautiously, she approached the door and peered through the peephole. An older woman with silver hair stood outside an umbrella dripping at her side. "Who is it?" Margaret called. "Barbara Simmons, Margaret. We were neighbors for 2 years. May I come in?" Margaret opened the door to find her former next-door neighbor, a retired nurse in her early 70s, standing with a concerned expression and a paper bag that emitted the enticing aroma of fresh pastries. "Barbara, how did you find me?" The woman stepped inside, folding her wet umbrella. "Small towns have big ears, dear. When I heard what happened after James's funeral, I started checking motels. This was my 3rd stop." She set the bag on the small table. "Brought you some breakfast. You look like you could use it." Margaret felt tears threatening at this simple kindness. She'd been so alone with her grief and shock that Barbara's appearance felt like a lifeline thrown to a drowning woman. They sat together, sharing coffee from the room's tiny pot and warm scones from Barbara's favorite bakery. Margaret found herself pouring out everything: the slap, the eviction, the safe deposit box, the will reading, even Vanessa's lunch invitation, and thinly veiled attempts at manipulation. Barbara listened without interruption, her nurse's eyes assessing Margaret with professional concern. When the story concluded, she reached across the table and squeezed Margaret's hand. "You're not alone in this," she said firmly. "And you're certainly not the first woman I've known who's been treated this way by family." Barbara explained she belonged to a support group called Wise Women, older women who had faced betrayal, financial abuse, or manipulation by family members. They met weekly at the community center, sharing resources, advice, and emotional support. "Come to our meeting tomorrow night," Barbara urged. "These women have navigated situations just like yours. They know which lawyers to trust, how to document evidence, how to protect yourself legally." Margaret hesitated only briefly before nodding. "I'd like that." Before leaving, Barbara paused at the door, her expression serious. "There's something else you should know. I used to see Vanessa shopping at Nordstrom when she claimed the family couldn't afford groceries. And that brother of hers, Victor, he would visit your house regularly when James was traveling for work. They seemed unusually close." Margaret absorbed this information, pieces clicking into place. "Thank you for telling me. Be careful, Margaret. People who are desperate for money can become dangerous when cornered." After Barbara left, Margaret replayed the visit in her mind. She wasn't alone anymore. There were allies, resources, others who understood. The tiny flame of resolve that had sparked when she discovered James's safeguards burned a little brighter now. Her phone buzzed with a text message. Unknown number, but the content made her heart leap. "Grandma, it's Lily. Using friend's phone. I miss you. Mom won't say where you went. Can we meet?" Margaret stared at the screen, joy and caution warring within her. Could this be a trap? Or was her granddaughter genuinely reaching out? She typed a careful reply. "I miss you too, sweetheart. How about the park near your school tomorrow at 3:30? I'll wait by the big oak tree." 3 dots appeared, then disappeared. Finally, "Yes, don't tell Mom. She's acting weird, throwing away Dad's stuff." Margaret's chest tightened. What else was Vanessa erasing in her absence? The next afternoon, Margaret arrived at the park early, positioning herself on a bench with clear sightlines to all entrances. The school day had ended, and children streamed through the gates, some lingering to play, while others headed home. She scanned each young face, heart pounding with anticipation and worry. What if Vanessa discovered their plan? What if this meeting put Lily in a difficult position? Then she saw her blonde hair in a messy ponytail, backpack slung over one shoulder, scanning the park with the serious concentration of a child on a mission. Margaret raised her hand in a small wave, and Lily's face broke into a smile that was pure James. The girl ran across the grass and flung herself into Margaret's arms. "Grandma, you disappeared." Margaret held her granddaughter tight, inhaling the familiar scent of strawberry shampoo and school supplies. "I'm sorry, sweetheart, it's complicated." They sat together on the bench, Lily's hand firmly gripping Margaret's, as if afraid she might vanish again. The girl looked thinner than Margaret remembered, with shadows under her eyes that no 12-year-old should have. "Mom said you decided to move out, that you wanted your own place." Lily began, her voice small. "But I heard her talking to Uncle Victor. She said mean things about you." Margaret chose her words carefully. "Your mother and I have different ideas about family, but nothing changes how much I love you, Lily. Nothing ever will." Lily nodded, then reached into her backpack and pulled out a leather-bound journal. "I found this in the donation box Mom was filling. She's getting rid of lots of Dad's things, saying we need to move forward." Her face crumpled slightly. "It's only been a week, Grandma." Margaret accepted the journal, recognizing James's initials embossed on the cover. "Your father's journal." "I think it's important," Lily whispered. "I took it before Mom could throw it away. She doesn't know I have it." Margaret felt a chill despite the afternoon warmth. "That was very brave, Lily." "Will you keep it safe? Mom keeps going through my room saying she's organizing. I'm afraid she'll find it." Margaret slipped the journal into her purse, mind racing with implications. "Yes, I'll keep it safe. Lily, is everything okay at home? Are you all right?" The girl shrugged, suddenly looking much older than her years. "Mom cries when people visit, But when they leave, she's on the phone with Uncle Victor talking about money and plans. She's different now. They spent the next hour together, Lily recounting school stories, while Margaret listened intently, storing away every detail of her granddaughter's life that she was missing. When it was time for Lily to return home, they embraced again, both reluctant to let go. "Can I see you again?" Lily asked, eyes pleading. "Yes, but we need to be careful. Your mother might not approve right now. Text me from your friend's phone when you can." As Lily walked away, turning back several times to wave, Margaret felt both heartened by the connection and disturbed by what she'd learned. That night in her motel room, she carefully opened James's journal, aware she was crossing an intimate boundary, but certain her son would want her to read it now. The entries spanned the past year, James's neat architect's handwriting filling page after page with observations, concerns, and increasingly troubling suspicions. Vanessa insists we can't afford Lily's science camp, yet somehow has a new designer bag. When I questioned the expense, she claimed it was a gift from her brother. Something doesn't add up. Found credit card statements showing charges I never approved. When confronted, Vanessa cried and accused me of not trusting her. Am I being paranoid or manipulated? Mom mentioned Vanessa told her we couldn't afford groceries last week. Yet we spent $500 at that fundraiser gala. Vanessa insisted we attend. The disconnect between what she tells me and what she tells others is concerning. The entries grew darker over time. Victor was at the house again when I returned early from my trip. The explanation about dropping off documents seems flimsy given how quickly they separated when I walked in. Something feels wrong. Discovered Vanessa has a separate account I knew nothing about. Significant funds have been transferred there over the past year. When I marry someone, I expect financial honesty. This feels like betrayal. The final entries, dated just weeks before James's death, sent ice through Margaret's veins. Consulted with Sam Bennett today about protecting Mom if anything happens to me. Vanessa's attitude toward her has become increasingly hostile when I'm not around. Lily notices it too. I've started documenting everything. Established the safe deposit box. Transferred investments into Mom's name. Bennett says everything is legally sound. I sleep better knowing she'll be protected. Still deciding about next steps with Vanessa. The evidence is mounting that I've made a terrible mistake in this marriage. Margaret closed the journal, hands trembling. James had known. He'd seen the manipulation, the financial deception, the possible affair with Victor. He'd been preparing not just for an unexpected death, but potentially for divorce. This journal was more than personal reflection. It was contemporaneous documentation of Vanessa's behavior, a legal treasure trove that would carry significant weight if matters went to court. The following morning, Margaret met with Samuel Bennett again, bringing both the journal and the recording from her lunch with Vanessa. The attorney listened carefully, occasionally taking notes, his expression growing more concerned. James came to see me about 3 months before he passed, Bennett confirmed after reviewing the evidence. He was troubled by financial irregularities and what he termed psychological manipulation within his household. He specifically mentioned concerns about your treatment and his daughter's well-being if anything happened to him. Was he planning to divorce her? Margaret asked directly. Bennett hesitated, weighing professional discretion against Margaret's need to understand. He was exploring his options. Let's put it that way. The attorney explained that Vanessa's financial situation might be more precarious than it appeared. James had discovered significant personal debt hidden from him, questionable investments made without his knowledge, and what appeared to be a pattern of financial secrecy. The life insurance payout is substantial, Bennett explained, but given what James uncovered, it might not last as long as Vanessa expects, especially if she continues her spending habits. Which makes her more desperate to get whatever might be in that safe deposit box, Margaret concluded. Precisely, and more likely to become aggressive when thwarted. Bennett leaned forward, his expression grave. Mrs. Wilson, I must advise caution. Document everything. Avoid being alone with Vanessa or her brother. And consider what your ultimate goal is here. Do you want financial compensation? Access to your granddaughter. Justice. Margaret considered the question. All of the above, I suppose. But most importantly, I want to honor what James tried to do. He protected me. Now I need to ensure his daughter is protected too. Bennett nodded. Then let's develop a strategy that accomplishes that without unnecessary escalation. 3 days later, Margaret received another invitation from Vanessa, this time for a small gathering to honor James's memory with family and close friends. The formal card with its elegant script and black border seemed at odds with the cold dismissal Margaret had received at the funeral. "This isn't about James," Barbara said when Margaret showed her the invitation during their coffee meetup. "This is about Vanessa maintaining her image as the perfect widow. She needs witnesses to her performance." Margaret agreed. "And she's probably hoping to pressure me publicly about the safe deposit box contents." "Then perhaps it's time to flip the script," Barbara suggested with a gleam in her eye. They spent the afternoon planning, joined by 2 other women from the Wise Women group: Eleanor, a retired judge, and Patricia, who had survived a similar family betrayal years earlier. Together, they crafted a strategy that made Margaret's pulse quicken, with both anxiety and anticipation. The evening of the memorial gathering arrived clear and cool, stars pricking the early spring sky as Margaret drove to her former home. She arrived deliberately early, knowing it would unsettle Vanessa to have her there during preparations. The house glowed with soft lighting, white flowers lined the walkway, and scented candles perfumed the living room. On a long table covered with delicate lace cloth stood framed photos of James, nearly all chosen by Vanessa from their wedding and vacations together. Margaret noted that not a single photo included her. Vanessa's expression tightened momentarily upon seeing Margaret in the doorway before she smoothed it into a welcoming smile. "Margaret, you're early. How lovely." "I thought I might help with final arrangements," Margaret replied pleasantly. "This was my home too, after all." The subtle reminder of her former status in the household made Vanessa's smile falter briefly. "Everything's under control. Why don't you make yourself comfortable in the living room? Guests will arrive soon." Margaret took a seat in a corner armchair, watching as Vanessa fluttered about adjusting flowers and straightening photo frames. She wore another black dress, this one with a modest neckline, but a form-fitting silhouette that emphasized her slender figure. Her pale skin seemed almost luminous against the dark fabric blonde hair falling in soft waves around expertly made-up features. The perfect grieving widow, camera-ready for her audience. Margaret smoothed her own deep blue dress against her dark skin, the color chosen deliberately to honor James, who had always said blue brought out the warmth in her complexion. Guests began arriving, James's colleagues from the architectural firm, neighbors, distant relatives, and friends. Margaret observed as Vanessa greeted each one, her voice trembling appropriately, eyes moistening on cue. She floated through the room with a wineglass, chatting quietly, accepting condolences with demure nods. "Life is so empty without James," Margaret overheard Vanessa telling James's former business partner. "He was my whole world." Family members nodded sympathetically. Some dabbed at tears. Others patted Vanessa's shoulder in support. Margaret remained silent in her corner, an outsider watching the performance with growing determination. Midway through the evening, when the living room was full of guests engaged in hushed conversations, Vanessa clinked her glass for attention. All eyes turned to her as she took center stage voice pitched to carry emotional weight. "Thank you all for being here to remember my husband," she began, eyes glistening. "James was a wonderful man, and I only hope to live in a way worthy of his love." Murmurs of approval rippled through the gathering. A cousin whispered about Vanessa's remarkable strength. An elderly aunt dabbed at tears. Margaret rose slowly from her chair, the pen recorder already activated in her pocket. "Excuse me," she said clearly. "I have something to share as well." All eyes swung toward her. Vanessa stiffened, then quickly smiled, her tone generous. "Of course, Margaret. Everyone knows how much you love James." Margaret walked slowly to the center of the room, her gaze sweeping across the assembled faces. She placed the pen recorder on the table beside Vanessa's wine glass, pressing play with a quiet click. Vanessa's voice filled the room, cold and clear, nothing like the tremulous tones they'd heard all evening. "She's just an extra expense. Once the funeral's done, I'm turning her room into a home gym. Don't worry, James is too soft. He'll never push back." The room went completely silent. Relatives and friends froze, glasses halfway to lips, expressions shifting from sympathy to shock. Several guests exchanged uncomfortable glances. Margaret remained still, saying nothing more. Their eyes said everything for her. Vanessa's face flushed crimson. Her lips trembled no longer with performed grief, but genuine panic. This must be edited," she stammered, hands rising in protest. "Someone's trying to set me up. You have to believe me. I would never, but the damage was done." An older aunt stepped forward, voice firm with disapproval. "Vanessa, that's your voice. No one can fake that little bitter laugh. We heard it plain as day." A cousin shook his head, disappointment evident. "I always thought you were cold, but this James deserved better." Vanessa looked around wildly, trying to smile, but it shattered under the weight of exposed truth. She reached for her wine glass with a shaking hand, but it slipped, red liquid spilling across the white tablecloth like an accusation. Margaret didn't add harsh words. She simply looked at Vanessa for a long moment, then addressed the stunned group. "I don't need to prove anything more. I just want everyone to know James was never blind. He saw the truth and protected his mother in his own quiet way. Today I let Vanessa's own voice speak for itself." The room remained uncomfortably silent, the mood irrevocably altered. People no longer looked at Vanessa with sympathy, but with cold, scrutinizing stares. The carefully constructed image of the devoted widow had crumbled in seconds, revealing the calculation beneath. Vanessa stood frozen. Her usual poise abandoned, her face drained of color. She seemed lost inside her own performance, with no script for this unexpected turn. Margaret returned to her seat, hand resting on her purse that still contained James's journal. She knew she had just struck the first public blow, but the true battle was yet to come. She had revealed Vanessa's nature to the family, but what would matter more was what happened next, the fight for Lily, for justice, for the truth James had worked so hard to preserve. As the gathering disintegrated around a mortified Vanessa, Margaret caught Barbara's eye across the room and received a subtle nod of approval. Phase 1 of their plan had succeeded perfectly. The war had begun in earnest. 2 days after the memorial gathering, the murmurs had spread through the family network like wildfire. Relatives who had once offered Vanessa unconditional sympathy now called Margaret with apologies and offers of support. James's elderly Aunt Mildred had even insisted on coming to the motel personally, bringing homemade casseroles and righteous indignation. "I always thought there was something off about that girl," Aunt Mildred declared, settling her substantial frame into the motel room's only armchair. "Too perfect, too polished. Nobody is that composed when they truly love someone." Margaret smiled, touched by the family's rallying. "James saw it too, eventually. That's why he left me protected." "Well, we're all behind you now," the older woman insisted. "Nobody treats family like that. Nobody." As heartening as this support was, Margaret knew the most dangerous phase was yet to come. Vanessa, publicly humiliated and exposed, would be desperate. People were most unpredictable when cornered. That evening, Margaret's instinct proved correct. Her phone rang shortly after 10, Vanessa's name flashing on the screen. She answered cautiously. "Margaret." Vanessa's voice was low, tightly controlled. "We need to talk. Not over the phone. In person. Tomorrow." "I don't think that's wise," Margaret replied evenly. "You've made your point," Vanessa hissed. "You've turned the family against me, but this isn't over. I still have Lily. Remember, if you want to continue seeing her, you'll meet with me. Alone." The threat hung in the air between them. Margaret's hand tightened on the phone. When and where? The coffee shop at the corner of Maple and 3rd, noon. Come alone. Margaret didn't sleep that night, torn between protecting herself and safeguarding her relationship with Lily. By morning, she had decided on a careful compromise. She would meet Vanessa, but not entirely on her terms. Barbara drove her to the coffee shop, parking across the street where she would have a clear view inside. Eleanor, the retired judge from the Wise Women group, was already seated inside, positioned to observe without being obvious. Margaret had the recorder in her purse, freshly charged. Vanessa arrived precisely at noon, her appearance showing subtle cracks in the perfect facade. Her eyes were shadowed with fatigue, her normally immaculate hair slightly disheveled. She slid into the booth across from Margaret without greeting. "You think you're clever," she began without preamble, "but you have no idea what you've started." Margaret met her gaze steadily. "I didn't start anything, Vanessa. You did the moment you decided James's mother was disposable." Vanessa leaned forward, voice dropping. "Let me be absolutely clear. I know James left more than keepsakes in that box. I know there's money, significant money, money that should rightfully be mine as his wife." "The law disagrees," Margaret replied calmly, "as did James. The law can be reinterpreted, wills can be contested, and grandmothers can lose access to their grandchildren very, very easily." There it was, the explicit threat Margaret had anticipated. She kept her expression neutral, aware the recorder was capturing every word. "Are you threatening to keep Lily from me?" Vanessa's smile was thin and cold. "I'm simply stating facts. Courts generally favor a child staying with their mother, and if that mother believes certain influences are unhealthy, well, judges listen." "Unhealthy influences," Margaret repeated. "Like learning that honesty and integrity matter? Like understanding that family means more than money? Like being poisoned against her own mother by a bitter old woman," Vanessa countered. Her fingers tapped an impatient rhythm on the table. "Here's my offer. One last time. We split the money from the box. You sign a legal document promising never to speak about our private family matters to anyone. In exchange, you get scheduled visits with Lily." Margaret took a slow, deliberate sip of her coffee, buying time to compose her response. "And if I refuse, then prepare for war. I'll contest the will addendum. I'll claim James wasn't competent when he made those changes. I'll make sure everyone knows his grieving mother took advantage of his declining mental state. I'll get a restraining order keeping you from Lily, and I'll win." The venom in Vanessa's voice was startling in its intensity. Gone was any pretense of the refined widow. Here was the raw desperation of a woman who saw her carefully constructed world crumbling. "I need time to think about it," Margaret said finally. "You have until tomorrow, noon. Then the offer expires." Vanessa stood gathering her purse. "Don't test me, Margaret. You have no idea what I'm capable of." As Vanessa stalked out of the coffee shop, Margaret released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Across the room, Eleanor nodded once, confirming she'd witnessed everything. Outside, Barbara hurried over from her observation post. "Are you all right? What happened?" Margaret showed her the recorder. "I got everything. The threats, the attempted extortion, the plan to falsely claim James was incompetent. Everything." "Good girl," Barbara said, helping Margaret to her feet. "Now let's get this to Samuel Bennett immediately." The attorney listened to the recording twice, his expression growing increasingly grave. When it finished, he leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled. "This changes things," he said finally. "Threats to withhold visitation as leverage for financial gain. Stated intent to file false claims about James's mental competency. Clear intent to commit perjury." He shook his head. "Mrs. Wilson, I believe we now have grounds not just for defending your interests, but for potentially pursuing a case for attempted extortion and possibly even a custody modification." "Custody?" Margaret echoed, surprised. "I never intended—" "Not full custody," Bennett clarified, "but a court-ordered visitation schedule that Vanessa cannot interfere with, and possibly even a guardian ad litem appointed to represent Lily's interests independently. Given the documented pattern of dishonesty and the willingness to use a child as a bargaining chip, a family court judge might find that warranted." Margaret considered this, torn between hope and caution. "What's our next step?" "We respond to Vanessa's ultimatum, but not in the way she expects. I'll draft a letter outlining the legal consequences of her proposed actions. Meanwhile, I suggest you continue gathering support from family members who witnessed her behavior at the memorial gathering. The more people willing to testify about her character and actions, the stronger our position." As Margaret left the lawyer's office, she felt a curious mixture of dread and determination. The conflict was escalating beyond anything she had anticipated when she first discovered James's safety net. But underneath the anxiety was a steely resolve she would not allow Vanessa to erase her from Lily's life or to dishonor James's careful preparations. The following day, precisely at noon, Margaret called Vanessa rather than meeting in person as demanded. "I've made my decision," she said when Vanessa answered, "and—" the word crackled with impatience. "No deal. I won't be blackmailed, and I won't allow you to use Lily as leverage." A moment of stunned silence, then Vanessa's voice returned frigid with rage. "You've made a terrible mistake. Don't say I didn't warn you." "Actually, Vanessa, I think you'll find you're the one who's made the mistake." Margaret's voice remained steady. "By now, your lawyer should be receiving correspondence from Samuel Bennett outlining the legal consequences of attempted extortion and the use of a minor child as a bargaining chip. He's also filing for court-ordered visitation rights that you cannot interfere with." "You're bluffing," Vanessa hissed, but uncertainty threaded through her voice. "The coffee shop conversation is on record. So is your threat to falsely claim James was mentally incompetent. Evidence of your character is mounting, Vanessa. The question is how much more you want to add to it." The line went silent for several seconds. When Vanessa spoke again, her tone had changed entirely, no longer threatening but wheedling, almost pleading. "Margaret, please, you don't understand the pressure I'm under. The financial situation isn't what everyone thinks. James left. Complications. I need that money. I'm not asking for all of it anymore, just enough to stabilize things." The sudden shift in tactics was jarring, but not entirely unexpected. Margaret had seen enough of Vanessa's manipulations to recognize this as simply another performance. "I suggest you speak with your lawyer," Margaret replied firmly. "And Vanessa, if anything happens to James's journal that Lily rescued from the donation box, copies of its contents are already in safe hands." A sharp intake of breath confirmed Margaret's suspicion that Vanessa had discovered the journal was missing. "This isn't over," Vanessa said, voice barely above a whisper. "On that we agree," Margaret replied, ending the call. The next week passed in a flurry of legal correspondence and preparation. Samuel Bennett filed for emergency court-ordered visitation rights, attaching the recordings as evidence of Vanessa's attempts to use Lily as leverage. Family members provided affidavits about the memorial gathering incident and other observations of concerning behavior. Meanwhile, Margaret continued attending the Wise Women meetings, drawing strength from others who had navigated similar waters. With Barbara's help, she found a small apartment she could afford, with the investment income from James's foresight, a modest one-bedroom on the third floor of a building overlooking the city park, filled with morning light and far more cheerful than the motel room that had been her temporary refuge. She was arranging books on her new shelves when the phone rang. Samuel Bennett's name appeared on the screen. "Mrs. Wilson, we've had a development. Judge Harmon has granted the emergency visitation order and appointed a guardian ad litem for Lily. You'll have structured visits beginning this weekend regardless of Vanessa's preferences." Margaret sank onto her new sofa, overwhelmed with relief. "Thank you, Samuel. Thank you." "There's more," he continued. "Vanessa's lawyer has contacted me requesting mediation. I think she's realized how damaging a full court battle would be to her reputation and financial situation." "What does she want?" "To negotiate a settlement that allows her to save face while securing your rights to see Lily and maintain your financial independence." "I believe we're in a position of strength here, Mrs. Wilson." She's backing down. After the call ended, Margaret moved to her small balcony overlooking the park. Spring was advancing, tender green leaves unfurling on the trees below. Children played on the swings, their laughter carrying up to her third-floor perch. For the first time since James's death, she felt something like peace washing over her. The battle wasn't over. She harbored no illusions that Vanessa would transform overnight into a trustworthy co-guardian for Lily, but the most acute danger had passed. Margaret thought of the journal hidden safely in her new apartment, the recordings preserved in multiple locations, the financial security James had ensured for her. She thought of Barbara and the wise women of Samuel Bennett's steady guidance of family members who had finally seen through Vanessa's facade. Most of all, she thought of James, his foresight, his love, his determination to protect those he cared about, even when he could no longer be present. She had honored his efforts by refusing to be silenced or pushed aside. She had found her voice, her strength, her path forward. The sun was setting now, casting long shadows across the park below. In 2 days, she would see Lily again, officially, legally, without fear or secrecy. They would build new memories in this apartment, create new traditions to honor James's memory. Margaret Wilson was no longer just a widow, no longer just a bereaved mother, no longer an unwanted guest. She was a woman who had faced betrayal and found justice, who had endured loss but discovered new purpose. She was at last herself again. The mediation room at the Milwaukee County Courthouse felt deliberately neutral with its pale gray walls and generic watercolor landscapes. Margaret sat with Samuel Bennett on one side of the polished oak table, hands folded calmly in her lap, despite the storm of emotions churning beneath her composed exterior. Across from them, Vanessa and her attorney, a sharp-featured woman in her 40s named Catherine Morrow, arranged papers with practiced efficiency. In the 6 weeks since James's funeral, Margaret had traversed the landscape of grief, betrayal, and rediscovery. The frightened widow who had packed her belongings in the middle of the night had transformed into a woman who understood her own strength. Today would determine whether that strength would be enough. Judge Eleanor Reeves, a silver-haired woman in her 60s with keen eyes that had witnessed decades of family disputes, sat at the head of the table. Beside her was Melissa Donovan, the court-appointed guardian ad litem, assigned to represent Lily's interests. The young social worker had spent the past 2 weeks interviewing everyone involved, including several hours with Lily herself. "Let's begin," Judge Reeves said, her voice gentle but authoritative. "We're here to determine a framework for Mrs. Wilson's visitation rights with her granddaughter Lily Wilson, and to address certain financial matters relating to the estate of James Wilson. I expect these discussions to remain civil and focused on the best interests of the minor child." Her gaze swept across both parties, lingering a moment longer on Vanessa, who shifted uncomfortably. "Ms. Donovan, please share your initial assessment." The guardian ad litem opened her folder. "Your Honor, after extensive interviews with all parties, including Lily, I've concluded that maintaining a strong relationship with her grandmother is clearly in Lily's best interest. The child expresses profound affection for Mrs. Wilson and has been distressed by their separation." Vanessa's jaw tightened visibly. "Furthermore," Melissa continued, "there are concerning indicators of an attempt to alienate Lily from her grandmother following Mr. Wilson's death. Lily reports being told her grandmother abandoned them, which directly contradicts established facts about Mrs. Wilson's removal from the family home." Judge Reeves nodded. "Thank you. Mrs. Wilson, what are you seeking in terms of visitation?" Margaret leaned forward slightly. "I'm requesting regular, consistent time with my granddaughter. Weekends, twice monthly, one afternoon, weekly after school, shared holidays, and the ability to attend her school functions and activities. I'm not looking to interfere with Vanessa's primary custody, only to maintain the relationship Lily and I have always had." "And you've secured appropriate housing?" the judge asked. "Yes, Your Honor. I've leased a 1-bedroom apartment near the city park. It has a study alcove that I've prepared as Lily's space with a desk for homework and a comfortable pull-out bed." Judge Reeves turned to Vanessa. "Mrs. Wilson, your position." Vanessa straightened the perfect picture of dignified concern. "I've never intended to keep Lily from her grandmother. I simply believe structured, limited visits would be healthier while we all adjust to our new reality. Perhaps one afternoon monthly to start building from there if things go well." Catherine Morrow added smoothly, "My client is concerned about emotional stability. Mrs. Wilson has made certain accusations that could create conflict and confusion for the child. Samuel Bennett intervened before Margaret could respond. Your Honor, if I may, the accusations referenced are documented facts captured on recordings that this court has reviewed. Mrs. Wilson has never discussed these matters with Lily and has no intention of doing so. The judge raised a hand to pause the brewing confrontation. I've reviewed the evidence submitted by both parties. Let's be clear, the recordings present significant concerns about Mrs. Vanessa Wilson's conduct following her husband's death. While not directly relevant to visitation rights, they do inform the court's understanding of the family dynamics. She turned to Melissa. Ms. Donovan, in your professional opinion, is there any reason to restrict Mrs. Margaret Wilson's time with her granddaughter? None whatsoever, Your Honor. In fact, I would argue the opposite. Lily is struggling with the loss of her father. Arbitrarily removing her grandmother as well compounds that trauma unnecessarily. I recommend implementing Mrs. Wilson's requested schedule immediately. A flash of defeat crossed Vanessa's face before she masked it. Margaret recognized the look Vanessa was realizing her leverage was evaporating. Without the ability to control access to Lily, her bargaining position weakened considerably. Judge Reeves nodded decisively. I'm inclined to agree. Let's establish the following schedule. Mrs. Margaret Wilson will have visitation with Lily on alternating weekends from Friday after school until Sunday evening, Wednesday afternoons, weekly shared holidays on a rotating basis, and unrestricted access to school functions. She fixed Vanessa with a firm look. Mrs. Vanessa Wilson, any attempt to interfere with this schedule will be viewed unfavorably by this court. Is that understood? Vanessa nodded stiffly. Yes, Your Honor. Excellent. Now to the financial matters. For the next hour, the discussion revolved around James's estate. Vanessa's attorney argued that the safe deposit box contents should be considered part of the marital assets, despite the explicit will addendum. Samuel Bennett countered with documentation of Margaret's original $40,000 contribution to the house purchase, demonstrating that James had merely grown that investment specifically for his mother. Throughout the discussion, Margaret observed Vanessa carefully. Her daughter-in-law maintained her composed facade, but subtle signs of strain appeared: a tightness around her eyes, a slight tremor in her hands, the occasional pressing of fingers against her temple. Mrs. Vanessa Wilson, Judge Reeves said finally, my understanding is that you've received a substantial life insurance payment and retained the family home and vehicles. Is that correct? Yes, Your Honor, but the financial situation is more complicated than the court has been led to believe, Judge Reeves interrupted. Mrs. Wilson, the documentation provided by your late husband's attorney indicates you have outstanding personal debts, approximately equal to the insurance payout debts your husband may not have been fully aware of. Is this accurate? Vanessa's face paled slightly. There were investments that didn't perform as expected. I see. The judge's tone conveyed she saw entirely too much. Having reviewed all documentation, I find that the contents of Safe Deposit Box A517 were legally and properly designated to Mrs. Margaret Wilson through valid amendment to James Wilson's will. These assets are not subject to marital property division, particularly given their origin as Mrs. Margaret Wilson's contribution to the family home. She closed her folder with finality. Mrs. Margaret Wilson will retain full rights to the approximately $200,000 in investments and cash held in the box. However, she paused, looking at Margaret thoughtfully. However, I would suggest that as a gesture of goodwill, Mrs. Margaret Wilson might consider covering certain educational expenses for Lily directly, not as a payment to Mrs. Vanessa Wilson, but as a grandparent's investment in her grandchild's future. Margaret nodded immediately. I had already planned to establish a college fund for Lily, Your Honor. Very good. Then unless there are other matters, this mediation is concluded. The court clerk will prepare the formal visitation schedule, which will take effect immediately. As the judge gathered her materials, Vanessa leaned toward her lawyer, whispering urgently. Catherine Morrow shook her head slightly, then addressed the judge. Your Honor, my client would like to request a brief private conversation with Mrs. Margaret Wilson before we conclude today. Judge Reeves raised an eyebrow. Mrs. Margaret Wilson, are you amenable to this? Margaret hesitated, then nodded. Yes, I'm willing. Very well. You may use this room for 10 minutes. The rest of us will step out. As the others filed from the room, Margaret steeled herself. She had anticipated this moment, Vanessa making one final attempt at manipulation when all legal avenues had failed. Samuel Bennett squeezed her shoulder supportively before closing the door, leaving the two women alone. Silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken accusations. Vanessa's carefully maintained poise seemed to dissolve, revealing the exhaustion beneath. You've won, she said finally, voice flat. Are you satisfied now? Margaret shook her head slowly. This was never about winning, Vanessa. It was about survival, about honoring what James wanted for both me and Lily. You've made me look like a monster. You did that yourself, Margaret replied quietly. I simply revealed what was already there. Vanessa's eyes flashed with familiar anger, but it quickly subsided, replaced by something more complex, perhaps resignation, perhaps fear. I can't maintain the house on my own, not with the debts. Once I sell it and settle everything, there will be very little left. I'm aware. Is that what you wanted? To see me homeless? To see Lily's life disrupted? Margaret leaned forward, meeting Vanessa's gaze directly. What I want is very simple. I want to be part of Lily's life. I want the respect I've earned as her grandmother and as the woman who helped build the home you've been living in, and I want the truth acknowledged. The truth, Vanessa laughed bitterly. Whose truth? James wasn't the perfect husband everyone thinks. He was controlling, obsessed with tracking every penny. Because you were hiding expenditures and lying about finances, Margaret interrupted calmly. I've read his journal, Vanessa. I know about the secret accounts, the hidden debt, the shopping trips with your brother when James was traveling. Vanessa fell silent, color draining from her face. But that's between you and James now, Margaret continued. What matters going forward is Lily. She's lost her father. She doesn't need to lose her sense of family stability, too. She reached into her purse and withdrew a small envelope, sliding it across the table. This is information about a 2-bedroom apartment in a good school district not far from my new place. The rent is reasonable and the security deposit is covered, if you're interested. Vanessa stared at the envelope without touching it. Why would you do this? Not for you, Margaret said frankly. For Lily. And because it's what James would have wanted. Vanessa's perfectly manicured fingers finally reached for the envelope, opening it with uncharacteristic uncertainty. She scanned the contents, brow furrowed. This is unexpected. Life often is, Margaret replied, gathering her purse as she stood. The judge was right about one thing, Vanessa. We need to find a way forward that puts Lily first. I'm willing if you are. Before Vanessa could respond, Margaret moved toward the door, pausing with her hand on the knob. One more thing. The recordings, the journal, the financial documents, they stay in my possession. Not to use against you, but to ensure we maintain our new understanding. Are we clear? Vanessa nodded slowly, something like respect flickering briefly in her eyes. Crystal clear. Outside in the hallway, Samuel Bennett waited with visible concern. Everything all right? Yes, Margaret said, surprising herself with how true it felt. I think we've reached an understanding. As they walked through the courthouse corridors, Margaret felt a strange lightness in her step. The legal battle had concluded largely in her favor, but the victory wasn't what brought her peace. It was the knowledge that she had stood her ground, had honored James's intentions, and had secured her place in Lily's life. What happens now? She asked Samuel as they descended the courthouse steps into spring sunshine. The attorney smiled. Now, Mrs. Wilson, you start living again. Friday afternoon arrived with golden spring sunshine and a gentle breeze, perfect weather for new beginnings. Margaret had spent the morning preparing her apartment, ensuring Lily's space was welcoming without being overwhelming. Fresh sheets on the pull-out bed, a small vase of daisies on the desk, a bookshelf stocked with titles she remembered her granddaughter enjoying. At precisely 3:30, her doorbell rang. Margaret took a deep breath before opening it to find Lily standing there, backpack slung over one shoulder, a small overnight bag in hand. Behind her, Vanessa waited by the elevator, maintaining the distance specified in the visitation agreement for drop-offs. "Grandma," Lily launched herself forward, wrapping her arms around Margaret's waist. Margaret embraced her, tightly breathing in the familiar scent of strawberry shampoo. "Hello, sweetheart. I've missed you so much." Over Lily's shoulder, she caught Vanessa's gaze and nodded slightly. Vanessa returned the gesture before stepping into the elevator, disappearing behind closing doors. "Come see your room," Margaret said, ushering Lily inside. "Well, your space. I've tried to make it special." Lily explored the apartment with unabashed curiosity, exclaiming over the sunny kitchen with its window herbs, the small balcony overlooking the park, and especially the study alcove Margaret had transformed for her use. "You have books." She ran her fingers along the spines on the shelf. "And is that a telescope?" "For watching stars from the balcony," Margaret confirmed. "Your father loved astronomy at your age." Lily's smile dimmed slightly at the mention of James. "I miss him so much, Grandma." "I know, sweetheart. I do too." Margaret sat beside her on the pull-out sofa. "That's why it's so important that we have each other." "Mom's been different," Lily confided, voice dropping to a whisper despite them being alone. "She cries a lot when she thinks I'm asleep, and we're moving to an apartment soon. She says we can't afford the house anymore." Margaret nodded, choosing her words carefully. "Sometimes after we lose someone, many things have to change. But change isn't always bad. Your mom is doing her best to make sure you're taken care of. Are you and Mom still fighting?" The direct question caught Margaret off guard. She considered deflecting, but decided Lily deserved honesty appropriately framed. "We've had our disagreements about what should happen after your dad died," she acknowledged. "But we've worked most of it out now. We both love you very much, and that's what matters most." Lily seemed to accept this, leaning against Margaret's shoulder. "I'm glad you didn't go away forever like Dad did." The simple statement pierced Margaret's heart. She wrapped an arm around her granddaughter, pulling her close. "I'm not going anywhere, Lily. I promise." They spent the weekend establishing new patterns, baking cookies in Margaret's compact kitchen, exploring the park across the street, setting up the telescope on the balcony to observe the night sky. Lily shared stories from school and confided her worries about the upcoming move from the only home she'd known. On Sunday evening, as they prepared for Vanessa's arrival to pick up Lily, Margaret presented her granddaughter with a gift, a leather-bound journal with Lily's name embossed on the cover. "Your father kept journals," she explained. "It was his way of sorting through his thoughts. I thought you might like to try it too." Lily ran her fingers over the embossed letters. "Did Dad write about me?" "He wrote about you all the time," Margaret assured her. "About how proud he was of you, how smart you are, how much he loved watching you grow." "Can I read his journals sometime?" Margaret hesitated. "Some parts, yes, when you're a bit older. I've saved the most special entries for you." The doorbell rang, signaling Vanessa's arrival. Lily gathered her belongings, tucking the new journal carefully into her backpack. At the door, she hugged Margaret fiercely. "Wednesday's only 3 days away," she said, as if reassuring herself. 3 days," Margaret agreed. "And I'll be at your science presentation on Tuesday, remember?" Lily's face brightened. "You will. Front row. I wouldn't miss it." Vanessa stood in the hallway dressed more casually than Margaret had ever seen her, jeans and a simple blouse, hair pulled back in a ponytail. Their eyes met over Lily's head, and a wordless understanding passed between them. This new arrangement might be forced by legal necessity, but they would make it work for Lily's sake. "Did you have a good weekend?" Vanessa asked, her tone neutral but not hostile. "The best," Lily enthused. "Grandma has a telescope and we saw Jupiter's moons." "That sounds wonderful," Vanessa replied, and Margaret detected genuine warmth in her voice. "You can tell me all about it on the drive home." As they turned to leave, Vanessa paused. "The apartment information you provided, we're moving in next weekend. It's It's a good fit, thank you." The acknowledgement clearly cost her pride, but Margaret appreciated the effort. "I'm glad. Let me know if you need any help with the move." After they left, Margaret stood on her balcony, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of pink and gold. The park below teemed with Sunday evening activity families, enjoying the last hours of the weekend joggers, circling the path, an elderly couple feeding ducks at the small pond. She thought of James, of how he would approve of this new chapter. She had protected his legacy and ensured his daughter would grow up knowing how much he had loved her. She had secured her own future and regained her sense of self. And perhaps most surprisingly, she had found a path forward with Vanessa that, while not friendly, at least promised civil cooperation. The weeks that followed established a new rhythm to Margaret's life. Wednesdays and alternate weekends with Lily became the anchoring points around which everything else revolved. She attended school functions, proudly volunteered at the library 2 mornings a week, and continued meeting with the wise women, now offering support to others facing similar challenges. Barbara had become a true friend, dropping by for coffee or accompanying Margaret on walks through the park. They were planning a weekend trip to Door County in the summer, something Margaret wouldn't have imagined possible during those dark days at the roadside motel. One Tuesday afternoon, Margaret sat in a coffee shop near the school, waiting for Lily to join her for their weekly homework session. The door chimed, and she looked up, expecting her granddaughter. Instead, Vanessa entered, scanning the room before spotting Margaret. This unscheduled encounter might once have filled Margaret with dread, but now she merely felt curious as Vanessa approached her table. "May I join you?" "Just for a moment?" Vanessa asked, none of her former hostility evident. Margaret gestured to the empty chair. "Of course." Vanessa sat, hands clasped tightly before her. She looked different, thinner, less polished, but somehow more authentic. The perfect widow's mask had been set aside. "I wanted to speak with you privately before Lily arrives," she began, voice low. "There's something you should know." Margaret waited, sensing the importance of whatever Vanessa had come to say. "I've been seeing a therapist," Vanessa continued. "It was part of our agreement with the court, but I found it helpful, more than I expected." "I'm glad to hear that," Margaret replied sincerely. "She's helped me understand some things about myself, about why I reacted the way I did after James died." Vanessa paused, visibly gathering courage. "My parents lost everything when I was 16. We went from comfortable to destitute overnight. I watched my mother beg relatives for help and be turned away. I promised myself I would never be that vulnerable." Margaret nodded, pieces clicking into place. "Fear is a powerful motivator." "It doesn't excuse what I did," Vanessa acknowledged. "How I treated you, the things I said. But I thought you should know that I'm working to be better, for Lily's sake. And because—" she hesitated, "because James deserved better from me." The admission clearly cost her, and Margaret recognized the gesture for what it was, not quite an apology, but an acknowledgement of wrong. A beginning. "Thank you for telling me," Margaret said simply. Vanessa reached into her purse and withdrew a small velvet pouch. "I also wanted to return this. It was James's. I think he would want you to have it." She placed the pouch on the table and stood. "Lily will be here any minute. I should go." As Vanessa walked away, Margaret opened the pouch. Inside was James's watch, the one Robert had given him for his college graduation, inscribed with the words, "Time reveals truth." Margaret had wondered what had happened to it after James's death. The small gesture touched her deeply, not because the watch itself was particularly valuable, but because it represented Vanessa's recognition of Margaret's place in James's life and in Lily's. When Lily arrived minutes later, bubbling with excitement about her science project, Margaret tucked the watch safely away. There would be time to share its significance later, when Lily was older and could fully appreciate the journey that had brought them all to this point. 6 months after James's death, on a bright October morning, Margaret, Vanessa, and Lily stood together at his grave. The summer's vibrant flowers had given way to autumn's more subdued palette, fallen leaves creating a golden carpet around the headstone. "I still talk to him sometimes," Lily admitted, placing a small stone atop the marker as they had taught her a symbol that someone had visited had remembered. "Is that weird?" "Not at all," Margaret assured her. "I talked to him too." "So do I," Vanessa added softly, surprising them both with the admission. They stood in silence for a moment, 3 lives irrevocably connected by the man who lay beneath the marble stone. The spring's bitter conflict seemed distant now, replaced by a cautious truce that occasionally, in moments centered around Lily, hinted at something close to understanding. Margaret placed the photograph of James's graduation on the grave, the one she had gifted Vanessa all those months ago. "You protected me as you promised," she whispered. "Now I'm helping look after your family." Later that afternoon, Margaret sat on her balcony watching children play in the park as twilight approached. Barbara had dropped by with fresh apple cake, and they shared tea as they discussed the Wise Women's upcoming holiday charity drive. "You seem at peace," Barbara observed, studying Margaret over the rim of her cup. "I am—" Margaret realized, somewhat surprised by the truth of it. "Not completely. I don't think we ever fully recover from losing a child, but I've found a way forward." "And Vanessa? Has she truly changed?" Margaret considered the question carefully. "Changed might be too strong a word. Evolving, perhaps. She's trying for Lily's sake. That's enough for now." After Barbara left, Margaret remained on the balcony as stars began to appear in the darkening sky. From inside came the sounds of Lily working on her homework, occasionally humming to herself the comfortable domesticity Margaret had feared lost forever in the aftermath of James's death. She thought of the silver key now kept in a small memory box rather than carried as a weapon. She thought of James's journals carefully edited and preserved for Lily to read when she was older. She thought of the watch returned as a gesture of reconciliation, however tentative. Most of all, she thought about how grief and betrayal had nearly broken her, but in surviving them she had discovered strengths she never knew she possessed. The frightened woman who had fled her home in pre-dawn darkness had found her voice, her courage, and ultimately her justice. Margaret rose and went inside, closing the balcony door against the evening chill. Lily looked up from her science textbook, offering a smile so like James's, it momentarily took Margaret's breath away. "Need any help, sweetheart?" she asked, settling beside her granddaughter at the table. "I think I've got it," Lily replied confidently. "But could you check my work when I'm done?" "Always," Margaret promised, and in that simple word lay everything she had fought for: the right to be present, to continue loving, to remain an essential thread in the fabric of her granddaughter's life. Outside, night fell completely over the city. Inside Margaret's apartment, warm light gleamed on the silver-framed photographs arranged on shelves and tables, James as a child at his graduation holding newborn Lily, Margaret and Robert on their wedding day, more recent images of Lily at the park on the balcony with the telescope baking cookies in Margaret's kitchen. A visual testament to the truth that while death may end a life, it cannot end a legacy of love. Or as James had written in his final journal entry found tucked inside the watch Vanessa had returned, "What matters most is not what we leave behind, but who we leave behind, and how well we've prepared them to carry on without us." Margaret Wilson had carried on, not just survived but thrived, transforming grief into purpose and betrayal into wisdom. She had honored her son's foresight by finding the strength to stand her ground when it mattered most, and in doing so she had discovered that justice, when it finally arrives, bears a striking resemblance to peace.